The ego is not good or bad. It simply exists. Have you ever wondered what the ego is when people in spirituality talk about the ego? The ego is you. The ego is your identity. It's your sense of self. It's everything that you take yourself to be. What is your identity, right? What comes to mind? Maybe your political views, your religious views, whatever it is, where you come from, a lot of the things that you think, a lot of things that you do. All these things make up your ego. And your ego manifests itself into the world in a lot of different ways. It's very easy for people to understand that the ego manifests itself in the form of thoughts, right, in our mind. But the mind and body are ultimately one. They're not separate from each other. So the ego also manifests itself in our body in the form of tensions, contractions, holding patterns, repressing sensations and emotions, resistance. All sorts of physiological things relate to egoic mechanisms within us. So what am I doing in this video? I'm just talking about some general ideas around the ego, the nature of the ego, how it manifests, what it is, how it works, things like this. A lot of people think that the ego is bad, when in actuality, it just is what it is. The judgment that you apply to the ego is actually something that comes from the ego. It's something that comes from yourself. And without the ego, our species wouldn't have been able to survive. The ego is very useful for navigating reality in a very effective way and holds tremendous survival value. A strong sense of self means a strong sense of an ability to defend oneself, to manipulate the environment, to serve oneself, and to get what one needs in order to survive. And this is extremely selfish. And I don't mean that in a moral way, right? Things like selfish, selfless, I'm not using these in any sort of moral sense. So all this stuff is very selfish, which is very important for survival. Without the ego, our species probably wouldn't have survived this long. And many people will unconsciously judge the ego as bad. And even if they don't consciously say it's bad, the way that they go about talking about it, the tone of voice that they use, just their general ideas about it, all are kind of associated with it being bad. Now, the ego does create a lot of sickness. The ego does create a lot of dysfunction. And it's not a matter of, is the ego good or bad? It's a matter of integration. It's a matter of the ego's level of development, which I'll be talking about very shortly. The only core issues with the ego, like really at the rock bottom level, the core issues with the ego are our own lack of awareness of it. And it's that we have this strong belief that the ego is separate from everything else in existence. And this belief isn't just cognitive. Like, this stuff doesn't just manifest in the form of your own thoughts. It manifests deeply in the body as well. It's something that you feel, it's instinctual, it manifests in all sorts of ways that you're probably not aware of that extend beyond just your ordinary thinking. All of these systems inside of us are highly interconnected. Like I said, the ego manifests in the body in very deep ways, and if anything, it's dominantly manifesting in the body, mainly in the form of tensions, contractions, repressing sensations, resistance, holding patterns, stored repressed energies, things like this. So that's really it. It's our strong belief that the ego is separate and our lack of awareness of it. Those are the core issues here that we're really facing. And when it comes to stages of ego development, this is incredibly important for understanding the nature of ego. It's easy to fall into the trap of, let's say, listening to Eckhart Tolle talk about ego. And, a lot of spiritual people do that. They listen to Eckhart Tolle talk about ego, and then they get just like this conception of like, oh, that's just what the ego is. And it's nothing against Eckhart Tolle that I'm saying here. His book, The Power of Now, is very good. I'm talking about that book in particular here. It's very good. It outlines a lot of very core elements of ego near perfectly. Like, that book is a magnificent work of art. It's very profound. But the ego and its nature are so complicated that one person talking about it just won't really do it justice if what you want is a very comprehensive point of view on it, because you can take Eckhart Tolle's point of view on the ego, which holds a tremendous amount of truth, but then there's also other points of view on the nature of the ego that also hold a lot of validity. So there's actually stages of ego development. Not everyone's ego is the exact same, and people are at different levels of consciousness. There's levels of development. And the ego basically evolves. And as the ego evolves, the selfishness and the dysfunction of the ego begins to kind of fade away. As the ego evolves, people become more selfless, they become more understanding, empathetic, open to existence, they resist less. And basically, as the ego evolves within you, its impact on your mind begins to weaken, because we need to actually develop an ego in order to survive and navigate the world in a very functional way. We need to develop a concept of who we are in relation to who we are not in order to feed ourselves properly, clean ourselves properly, relate to others. See, notice my language here as well. It's ourself, others. It's like this dualistic worldview. We need this in order to just navigate reality effectively. We have to make these distinctions, and they're totally natural for the human mind to do. This is just how we survive. But they're not existentially true. As your ego evolves, your sense of self expands. So your sense of self goes from basically your tribe to your nation, begins to expand beyond that to the entire world, to the entire cosmos. And I'm missing some details there, but I'm trying to just paint a general picture for you that your sense of self probably limited by your family, maybe at around 4 years old, you're born into your family, and that's just what you really identify as, you, your family, and then it begins to expand slowly to, let's say, like your community, your school, more people. You find out that you live in a country because at one point you didn't even know that you lived in a country. And then it begins to expand to more and more countries in the entire world, and then the entire cosmos and the very fabric of existence itself, consciousness. And as you can see, this is a lot more complicated than a lot of what spirituality talks about when it comes to the ego. This begins to add a lot more nuance to the ego and really how to go about transcending it. So the ego naturally begins to transcend itself. The ego develops over time, and when we really begin to develop our ego, the deconstruction of the ego naturally occurs. When our ego is able to evolve in a healthy way, it will naturally deconstruct itself as well. This sort of pattern of transcending the ego occurs very organically and naturally within human psychology, right? These transpersonal levels of consciousness exist very organically, in the same way that an oak tree can go from like seed to sapling to, just all these stages to the point where it's a fully grown oak tree. And a tomato plant, for example, it goes from seed and then it kind of grows until it's like a fully grown plant. It's very similar for humans too. Our ego starts out where it is, and then it goes through stages of development. As the ego begins to evolve, there's a whole bunch of things that begin to occur. Your morals begin to shift. Your sense of self begins to expand. You can actually care about things like, let's say, your neighbor, or the environment, or the evolution of consciousness itself. These are things you can actually value. You can care about what goes on the other side of the world. You begin to be less selfish. Although you don't just disregard your more selfish tendencies, you transcend them and include them. So a selfish tendency, an example of that would be, I have to eat food, or like I need shelter, or like I need connection. These needs don't really go anywhere. You just are able to get them met in a more functional way. You're not so stuck in them, and you're not so hyper fixated on them to the point where everything outside of your own self is basically non-existent to you. So shifts in values, shifts in morals, shifts in the sense of who you are. I mean, the instinctual sense of who you actually are will change. Take your sense of self right now. Like really feel into the sense of who you are. That sense of self will change as your ego evolves. It will not stay the same. The sense of who you are is far more fluid than you probably think. The sense of who you are changes over time. And the more you begin to pay attention to these kinds of things, the more obvious it becomes that, oh yeah, the sense of who I am is a very clever illusion. It's really just a whole bunch of causes and conditionings that create this cohesive sense of me relative to something that is not me. So as the ego evolves, there's also a reduction in psychological emotional defensiveness. There's a more interconnected worldview that begins to arise. There's greater presence, greater awareness, greater empathy, greater love, more enhanced cognitive complexity. There's also an improvement in emotional regulation because the ego is like a major part of it is just the resistance mechanism, the avoidance mechanism, the struggling and fighting against the present experience. And that really creates a lot of dysfunction in you. It creates all sorts of disease in you in various ways, emotional, mental, physical, spiritual. And notice that even the way I think about these things are very interconnected. So as the ego evolves, it just begins to bridge certain things together. Things that seemed like there was no connection between them, it naturally begins to bridge them together because, well, everything is one. And the ego's ability to make sense of the world in an accurate way also increases as it develops. And we can really get a good idea of ego development at extremes. Right? The level of development of a 2-year-old is very different from the level of development of Gandhi or Albert Einstein or Erwin Schrödinger or Jesus or Buddha or me or you. The development of a tribal warlord is very different from the development of Mother Teresa or a saint or whoever, Saint Francis. The development of Adolf Hitler is very different from the development of, the average American, the average Canadian, the average Dutch person, the average Italian person. The average citizen doesn't really have that level of consciousness. They aren't interested in doing what Hitler did. Why? For a lot of reasons, but one of them being the level of their consciousness, a very fundamental part really being the level of their consciousness. So when we go from lower levels of development to higher levels of development, we move from selfish to selfless. Higher levels of consciousness increase their ability to be selfless because all the self-centered mechanisms, they're not really needed. The second your needs are met in a pretty healthy way and you're not always struggling to get food or just, pay your rent, or the second you're not just continuously struggling and you have energy freed up that you can use to transcend your ego, this just naturally occurs. This process just organically unfolds. If someone's always hyper fixated on I can't pay my rent and my relationship is always in shambles and I'm going to lose my job and I can barely even afford to feed myself, it's like you don't have a lot of energy to put to ego transcendence. Although it's not impossible under any circumstance to, move into a higher level of consciousness, it's just going to be a bit harder for people depending on situations that they're in. So the ego and its natural development takes us to self-realization. It actually takes us to truth. And the ego isn't something to shame. The ego isn't this horrible, evil monster. The ego, it thinks it's protecting you. All of these mechanisms that cause dysfunction and disease, they all believe that they're doing good. They all believe that they're keeping you well. They all believe that they're protecting you. They all believe that they're saving the world, even. The ego's natural development takes us to truth. It takes us to what the true nature of reality is. For real. The actual nature of what reality is for real. You're aware of what existence is, and you're very clear about what existence is. So the ego actually has to be integrated and transcended in a healthy way. And I talk to quite a lot of people in my one-to-one calls, and I've spoken to quite a few people who believe that they should just abandon their entire life because the Buddha said the only point of existence is to realize nirvana. I've actually heard this from a few people. And, what you should do with your life is complicated. I'm not going to get into that here. But this overlooks so much of what life is. The point of life isn't to just escape your existence. Enlightenment is the exact opposite of escaping your present circumstances and your existence. Enlightenment is the full embrace with no resistance to the present circumstance, to the present moment. When you're in a higher level of consciousness, you can't resist things anymore. That mechanism begins to just break. It becomes too uncomfortable. It's not worth it. It costs a lot of your energy to always be fighting and resisting reality. So the ego is to be integrated in a healthy way and even cleaned up. You actually got to do shadow work because you can awaken, you can get enlightened, and you have all sorts of unconscious and repressed shadow material. That's why there's enlightened teachers who can abuse students. They can be enlightened, but they have all sorts of unexamined neuroses and traumas and just shadows within them. This is called growing up, waking up, cleaning up, as a guy named Ken Wilber likes to call it. Growing up is the development of the ego. Waking up is, transcending the ego, really. It's about enlightenment, awakening. And then cleaning up is cleaning up the shadow, doing the necessary psychotherapeutic work to kind of clean out your mind so that it's free from these sort of stuck energies, repressed things in general, repressed emotions, repressed beliefs. So the ego isn't to be shamed, but it's to be understood. There's a massive difference between thinking that it's bad and just wanting to understand what it is for the sake of understanding, for just valuing truth, just for the sake of truth. Just what is the ego? Right? What are its mechanisms? How does it cause me suffering? How does it develop? Right? What's it really doing here? The ego is to be seen clearly for what it is. It's not really a matter of judging its existence. It's more so a matter of being conscious of its existence. Counterintuitively, when you judge its existence and when you hate its existence and you struggle and you fight against it, this all comes from the ego. Try actually loving the ego. Try fully accepting the ego. Try fully embracing it. This doesn't mean that you just allow anyone's ego and your own to just always be doing anything. This just means that you're not fighting against it anymore. This means that you're not resisting it. And just by not fighting against it, you can already slowly begin to see it in a more clear way. Because when you're constantly battling against all these parts of yourself, what's essentially going on here? What's going on is that you have certain parts of you just attacking other parts, and you're in this civil war. And this isn't really conducive to your well-being, your spiritual development, transcending the ego. This is the exact opposite of all of that. It's just more ego. You're just creating more dysfunction unconsciously. So instead of just hating your ego, thinking it's bad, all this stuff, try being grateful for it. Bring loving kindness to the ego. This is actually the things that are going to heal your psyche. They're going to make you just feel great. They're going to help you to begin to transcend the ego, and they're going to actually begin to just build understanding. This is really what you're going to want if you want to move beyond the ego. So humanity in general is actually at a turning point. Humanity, for however long we've been around, has been incredibly selfish. Our species as a whole is highly narcissistic. We talk about how we're the most intelligent and we put a man on the moon and how great we are, and we really just blow smoke up our own. And it's a total delusion. Our species is not that intelligent. Our species is very ridiculous, and we like to claim all sorts of things, but we have really no idea what we're talking about. We will claim that, we know what the universe is, or we know where it came from, or we know what anything is. It's completely wrong. We don't know what anything is. We have no idea where the universes came from. Our science has no idea about this kind of stuff. Mainstream humanity has never had any clue about this kind of stuff. Some people have. Enlightened beings, highly developed people actually do have answers to questions like this, and they're not really what you would expect. They're hard to understand because, by their very nature, they're highly developed. They're going to be pretty complicated things. Not in the sense that the answer is complicated, but in order to even have a mind that's capable of understanding the answer, that's complicated. So humanity's at a turning point. We've been pretty selfish, and we still are. And if we do not begin to deconstruct our ego and move into more selfless levels of development, we will have a lot of survival challenges. And we're seeing it right now, for example, with climate change and the environment. We're seeing it with wars. If we cannot actually empathize with our environment, with each other, if we cannot understand our environment and each other, if we cannot actually discover what is true about our existence, our species will suffer. We cannot continuously live in delusion, avoidance, resistance, separation, duality, just all this falsehood, repression, selfishness. We literally cannot afford to do this for too much longer. We will blow ourselves up with our weapons. We will destroy our environment. We will ruin our soil. Our food will be poisoned. A lot of our food already is poisoned with heavy metals. Our air's contaminated with heavy metals. So we actually need to move beyond our own ignorance and our own selfishness in order to continue surviving as a species. And this isn't like a doomsday message. That's not what I'm saying here. This is not one of those like 2012, the world is ending messages. I think it was 2012. I don't even remember. This is just a general point that if we were to continue on the trajectory of just lower levels of consciousness, we will die. We need to evolve and adapt to the world as it changes. We have to learn how to do that. We have to be more flexible. We have to be more honest, more transparent, more conscious, more aware, more empathetic, more understanding, more loving, more connected to each other. We have to actually care about what's true, not for the sake of just pushing our agenda forward, but just for the sake of what's true. An innocent caring about just what is really true. So again, this isn't a doomsday message, and I'm actually incredibly optimistic about our species' ability to evolve, to develop itself, and in many ways, we're a very profound species as well. We've had all sorts of very profound accomplishments in our science, in our spirituality, in our health, in our relationships. I'm not talking about not talking about this stuff at a very mass scale, because at a large scale, we, in a lot of cases, just still struggle with all sorts of our survival stuff. But we have found great success in quite a lot of things. And this is possible for our species to truly evolve and to just stop being so immature, because we're incredibly immature as a species. Like I said, as a whole, our species is very narcissistic. We're very full of ourselves. We're very self-centered. We're very uncaring about anything other than our own species and ourselves. So that's it for this video. I'm offering one-to-one coaching. You can book a free call. Link is in the pinned comment and the description. Take it easy.